I'm thrilled to welcome this evening Pulitzer Prize winner Eli Saslow to Skylark this evening to discuss his new book, Voices from the Pandemic. Eli is going to be interviewed by Skylark's very own free-range bookseller at large, Mary O'Malley. Mary, I know, has been raving about this book for some time, and if you haven't caught her weekly roundup of books on Thursday mornings on the Skylark Facebook page at 11 o'clock, then you absolutely should. It is essential viewing for anyone who is interested in reading and books. Mary has been working with us at Skylark for over a year now, I think, without ever coming to Missouri. And as we're about to hear, the COVID-19 virus has affected every one of us in myriad ways, large and small, but there remain silver linings to be found if you look for them. And Mary is certainly one of our silver linings. We're all learning to do our jobs differently these days, and working out how to sell books without setting foot in a bookstore is, I dare say, a good example of that adaptability that we have all had to learn over the past 18 months. In addition, can I say this, Mary? Am I allowed to say? So
Go for it.
We're all quite excited because Mary is literally waiting for the news about the arrival of her third grandson, which is, is probably going to happen while we are talking. So this is exciting days indeed. So Mary, thank you as always for being here and for doing what you do so well. Eli Saslow is a reporter for the Washington Post and the author of 10 Letters, American Hunger, and Rising Out of Hatred, which won, the 2019 Dayton Literary Peace Prize. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting in 2014 and was a Pulitzer finalist in feature writing in 2013, 2016, and 2017. If you enjoy this evening's conversation, please do help us out and purchase Eli's book from Skylark. You can either do that by going to the website or drop us an email at mail@skylark.com or give us a call at 573-777-6990. If you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A box or the chat box, or if you're watching on Facebook Live, please type it in the comments, and we will get those to those towards the end of the conversation. All right, without further ado, I'm going to try and remember how to turn myself off, and I will leave Eli and Mary to their conversation. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy the evening.
All right. Eli, are you here?
I'm here. I'm with you. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. There we are.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Alex. Appreciate that. Good to see you.
Oh my gosh. It's so good to see you, Eli. I could not be more thrilled to be talking to you about this incredible book. I am a super fan of yours ever since Rising Out of Hatred, and getting to spend time with you and Derek and Allison back in the in-store bookstore days. And so when I saw that you had something else coming out, I jumped at it without having any idea of just how profoundly affected I would be by this book. So would you please tell the people watching about Voices from the Pandemic and what this amazing book is all about?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that. And thanks for spending time with the collection of pieces, which is really what this book is. I mean, during my normal work for the Washington Post and as a journalist is I usually go and I spend a huge amount of time with the people that I'm writing about. And I almost sort of embed into their lives to write about how the circumstances of the country and what's happening in the country are playing out in real time in people's lives. Once the pandemic hit, it became pretty clear that kind of sort of really close up personal journalism was going to be hugely problematic, at least in those initial months. Like, not only would I be putting myself at some risk by getting on a plane and going to spend time with people, but I also would be putting the people that I write about at risk by showing up in their lives and suddenly sort of living alongside them. So really, this project started a little bit as, how can I still find a way to do meaningful, personal, intimate journalistic work when I can't necessarily be there to see everything myself. So that's where I kind of came up with the idea to do an oral history, where it's people telling their own stories. This is a collection of maybe 25 or 30 stories where I reached out to people in real time who were sort of at the center of something happening in the pandemic. And I would spend, hours, often dozens of hours on the phone with people, or sometimes in person with people as the pandemic went on, hearing them talk about their experiences and how their lives had been upended in ways, or how their minds had been transformed or changed. And then I would go through oftentimes, dozens and dozens of pages of transcripts from these conversations and sort of edit them and structure them into first person monologues, pieces that are all in these people's words, directly first person pieces from these subjects about the experience of enduring this pandemic. So the hope is that together, I think the collection tells the story of what the last year and a half in the country has been like. And certainly for me, in a year or now 2 years, that has been phenomenally depressing and challenging in so many ways, right? In terms of like the systemic and political failures, the way it feels like our country is so catastrophically polarized. Honestly, being on the phone with people, with strangers, and building close relationships with them, hearing them narrate oftentimes the worst experiences of their lives with clarity, with honesty, with heart, with empathy, that humanity was sustaining. It was like, surprisingly in some ways, the bright spot of the pandemic for me was hearing about what other people were going through. So I guess I also hope, as always with the work I do, that it's a little bit of a call to empathy and to think outside of ourselves and to think about what other people in the country are going through, especially since we're all so isolated right now, into our own bubbles, into our own physical spaces. I think finding ways to think about other people's experiences that are different from our own is more important than ever.
I could not agree more. As a bookseller, I consider that one of my biggest calls to action is to read outside of my own experience and then, share that with others and try and get them, as invested as I am. And so I do have a lovely finished copy of your book. I do, but I have my galley, which is dog-eared, book-darted, marked up, exclamation points, underlining, notes, hearts, all of this stuff. At what point during the pandemic did it click for you that you needed to capture this moment in time and start talking to people about it?
I think, honestly, almost right away. I mean, when the pandemic really first hit, I'd spent the last year before the pandemic writing a lot about kind of the collapse of the rural healthcare network in the United States. We have huge parts of the country now that don't have enough doctors, sort of like healthcare deserts, and also people who can't afford healthcare, hospitals that are sort of buckling under. And so I've been paying close attention to our fraying healthcare network. And coincidentally, in the first sort of week of the pandemic, I was actually embedded into a hospital, a rural hospital in Washington State, where I've been spending time again now, in Dayton, Washington, when they were getting their first COVID case. And being there during that, it became pretty clear to me that this was going to be a massive upending event, that the country was about to shut down, that people were going to be challenged not only in terms of their health and their survival, but also in terms of like their personal economics, keeping their homes, all of the other things that we've seen happen over the last year and a half. So, I think pretty much right away I knew something historic is happening, and that also made it feel like a worthy moment to try to do an oral history, which is something that had been new to me. I mean, this isn't the kind of journalism I've done before. It has a lot of similarities, but doing pieces that are first person was new. And also a lot of these stories were published in the Washington Post. It was also new to the Post. So figuring out even the ethics of how do we tell these stories? How do we do it fairly? How do we make sure that we're still fact checking people's experiences to make sure that it's accurate, even though they're first person pieces? We sort of had to build that infrastructure very early on in the pandemic to make it work. But I think the very first piece in this book, which is about a guy named Tony Sizemore, and he lost his partner, a woman named Bertie Shelton. she was the first coronavirus death in Indiana. And I was talking to him in real time, like during the days after Birdie had died. And so really from there, that's how I spent the next 14 or 15 months, and oftentimes like massively intense conversations with people who sometimes were at that very moment experiencing real trauma.
Yeah, and I can say that absolutely comes through in the stories, in the essays. I would have to set the book down and, take a couple of breaths and realize that this wasn't, happening to me or at this time. That's how well you write them. How did you find the people you talked to in this book?
Yeah, great question. And it's so much at the heart of sort of my work always as a journalist, I guess. I think the first thing is I wouldn't just find one person. So for every like Tony Sizemore or for every person who's in the book, I probably talked to 10 or 15 other people who I thought maybe this is the person whose experience I'm going to help narrate. Usually what I would do is, as the pandemic was going on, I would think, what's a major tension point right now in the pandemic? What's something that's happening this very moment that feels urgent and important? And how can I find a person who maybe can narrate that experience in a way that will make us not only understand it, but feel it in a different way? And so, say for instance, there was a time in the pandemic where all of a sudden it became clear that these masking conflicts, which have now just become part of living in America, were happening again and again and beginning to sort of disrupt communities. So, I would think to myself, what's a way to explore that? How can I maybe understand what's happening in these stores where people are refusing to wear masks again and again? And so I would start talking to clerks, basically store clerks around the country, who in places where like sheriff departments had said, we're not going to enforce a mask mandate, it was up to these $10 an hour frontline workers who were suddenly having to, have these confrontations again and again. And I would join like a Facebook group for store clerks during the time of COVID. I would talk to people who'd been on the other end of these sort of like viral videos where they'd been yelled at, or people had emptied their shopping carts because they'd asked them to wear a mask. I would talk to a dozen people to learn about what it was like. And in those conversations, I would also be looking for who's a person who I think can make people really feel and understand what this is like. So one of those conversations was with a woman in North Carolina, Lori. She works at a small mercantile store in a part of rural North Carolina. She often was the only person in the store. She was there by herself. She's a 60-plus-year-old woman, asthmatic, rightfully very afraid of this virus. And people started coming into her store without masks. And she had started by sort of putting out very polite signs in front of her store that would say, if you wear a mask, that's a way to show that you care about us. But people still came in unmasked. So her signs had gotten more and more forceful, like wear a mask or don't come in. Please don't walk past this sign if you don't have a mask on. Until eventually, Lori was sometimes keeping the door to the store locked and had Mace with her at the counter and was sort of living in fear of the next person who was going to come in and confront her about these mask regulations. So once I had that conversation with Lori, I realized maybe this is somebody who can cut through and help people understand what it's like to be in that position. And then I would spend a week where really all I would do was talk to Lori. I would say, can you put me on FaceTime with you while you're at the store so that I can see what it's like in the store when people come in? Can I talk to your coworkers to understand a little bit more about their experiences, and then bring those conversations back to Lori because it would help her remember things. And then at the end of that time, I would have a huge amount of transcription about from Lori about her life. And at that point, I would try to figure out what's a way to make this feel like a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end that will do justice to Lori's experience and make people understand it.
Yeah, that as booksellers, before the store I was at previously, before they closed their doors, we dealt with it regularly. And in fact, Alex, my boss and owner of Skylark, was doing an Instagram reel just last week wearing a mask because he's in the store with coworkers and customers, and that's what we do. And somebody made a comment on Instagram, take off the effing mask.
Yep.
And I I have a husband who's diabetic. And so I was so careful all the way through the beginning of this, because I figured I'm healthy, I'm not in the high risk age group. My health is good. But I have to be really careful for him.
Right.
And it wasn't until early this year that I was diagnosed with previously undiscovered heart and kidney issues.
Wow.
Where the doctor was like, you would have been one of those casualties where people would have said, oh, she was perfectly healthy, but COVID took her.
Right.
Because I had these. So, and so many of my bookseller friends, we have been front line to these anti-maskers, and Alex is in Missouri, which, has been a tough place to be. So her story rang very true with me. And again, the way you wrote it, I mean, I could feel my heart pounding. I could feel the rage coming up at these people, that continue to come in and just be so rude and so ignorant. Every one of your stories has stuck with me like that, incredibly.
That's so kind of you to say. And the truth is, like, one of the lessons to me from a year of having these conversations with people is that the disinformation, the conspiratorial thinking right now in the country, the groupthink, the polarization, a word that I just, it's impossible not to keep coming back to, is the hold of that right now. I think it was revealed to all of us, like, where we are with that. And another woman in the book, whose story certainly sticks with me, is also in Missouri. This woman, Amber Elliott, who's in St. Francois County, down like a more southern part of the state. But she was the public health director there, and she was trying to begin to get ready for a vaccine rollout, and also trying to encourage people to wear masks. And the backlash for that in that community, a county that I still think is probably certainly less than 45% vaccinated. The backlash for even suggesting that masks would be helpful was so intense that when Amber and others had brought the doctors to the community theater to try to talk to the community about COVID and what it was and why masking in certain cases is effective, the doctors had gotten booed off the stage. The doctors that were trying to save the people in this place. And Amber, her kids were starting to get followed at their baseball games and in all of these other places, until eventually Amber decided, I can't do this anymore. I'm trying to save a place that is not invested in saving itself. And the personal risks to me from doing this work, this like relatively lowly paid public health work, are now such that I'm afraid of doing this job. And so I was talking to her during what ended up being her last days on the job, as she was, during our conversation, sort of narrating her decision to quit. So, I think, like, it feels like a scary point when we have we're so fractured that there are communities in the country that that really the data, the science, and we're certainly seeing it now with vaccine uptake, it doesn't penetrate. And I think some of that is, we just surround ourselves now with so much information that is likely to confirm our ideas, whether it's by cultivating our own Facebook pages and the news feed we get on there. Like we're more likely to encounter information that already confirms our biases in the ways that we think, and that makes it really difficult to challenge some of that disinformation.
It does. I agree completely. And I imagine that with all of the time you spent with each person in this book, they'll all stay with you, but is there one story that you just feel like is going to haunt you?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, or maybe not, there's more than one. And honestly, I'm grateful for that, because the most fortunate thing about my job, and the thing that I love about it, is that it makes me feel like that's it is what a gift to sort of have be able to do work that is kind of like a passport into other people's experiences, and to grow my own ideas about what it's like to be a person in the world. But I think one that comes quickly to mind is a story from a woman named Francine Bailey, who just because she she tried to do everything right. I think because of like so much of the inequality that's still unfortunately at the heart of what America is, she was disadvantaged in a lot of ways that made the outcomes of her situation worse. I mean, so Francine, she's a CNA, like a nurse's aide. She was making $11 an hour at a nursing home in Hartford, Connecticut, a family, Jamaican American family, like 3 generations in one house, a family that was, all working low income jobs, just trying to get by, couldn't afford to not live together. So a lot of people in the same place. Francine at her work, they didn't provide proper PPE. They didn't have enough masks. They were asking people to reuse masks for days or even weeks at a time. Francine knew that that was a huge risk, but she needed the $11 an hour. She didn't have the luxury of staying home from work. So she kept going to her job, got sick very quickly, and got really sick. Went to the hospital, was having panic attacks, was having trouble breathing, but then came back home from the hospital and swore to herself that she was going to quarantine in one room of this house so that nobody else would get sick. Separated herself from her young daughter, even as her 4-year-old daughter was like banging at the door, being like, "Mom, where are you? What's happening? I can't see you." Francine stayed in her room until she had one panic attack that was so bad that she couldn't breathe. She needed air. And at one point she just burst out of her room and ran trying to get outside. And her mother heard her running outside, came and tried to comfort her and did what any, I think parent would do in that moment, and gave her daughter a hug. And in that 45-second exchange, at least in Francine's estimation, she passed the virus on to her mother. And over the ensuing days and weeks, Francine, while she was still quarantined in the upstairs room in this house, would lean down, put her ear to the floorboards so that she could listen to her mother breathing and coughing in the room under her. And as Francine said, her cough sounded like my cough. And that's when she knew. And her mother was older, had more pre-existing health conditions. And I think the second that she got sick, Francine felt correctly like her mother was not going to make it, and she didn't. And so, I think another thing that I learned a lot about in these conversations was guilt. I mean, one of the cruel things about a virus is it doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's we pass this to each other, right? It goes from one person to the next, sometimes despite our best intentions. It's also like, that's the same power behind a vaccine, is that we're all interconnected. When you can pass a virus to each other, you can also help protect each other by getting vaccinated. But I think it's, the cruelty of that guilt. And there are other pieces that thematically also centered on guilt. But her, Francine, it's been almost a year now since her mother died, and Francine has such like crippling PTSD that she can't leave the house, or if she does, she has to load up on anti-anxieties.
That's, her story was just heart-wrenching to read. And that, that was something that stood out for me in so many of your stories. And I imagine not because you, those were the stories you chose, it's because it's such a fact. COVID has shown such a spotlight on the income disparity in this country. So many people, like Francine, that either didn't have the luxury of either working remotely or taking time off, and she's working in this very high risk area. Other people who, so many of them who went from eking out a living pre-COVID to losing everything. I mean, they've been living okay. Maybe they had a roof over their head and they were able to feed themselves and their families and, have a few things. But when COVID hit and everything shut down, these people who were immediately homeless and without food and evicted. And I mean, it came through so much in your stories.
I'm glad, because I think mostly because that's true, right? Like and I think the more troubling thing is this pandemic has exacerbated all of those inequalities in massive ways. And while I hope that at some point, for some of us, this pandemic will end, it will end for those of us who are privileged enough to have it end. For a lot of people, their finances will not recover. They'll be evicted. They'll be so far behind on payments. And also, like the people who disproportionately got sick, the people who disproportionately died from this virus, like much more likely to be people of color, hourly workers on the front lines, had to go to work. They also have like much more ingrained trauma from this experience than people who were lucky enough to be cushioned by privilege and escape the worst impacts of it. So, you know, it's like similar to, say, the economic collapse in 2008 or other major events in the country. It's the effects are totally disproportionate, and you know, inequality, which is and you know, income inequality and all of these things that have been worsening at historic rates already in the country. I think one of the long legacies of this pandemic will be making that an even more dramatic divide in the United States.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That came through. And you know, you talked about the empathy, and I am quite an empath. I almost to a fault. And with your gift for bringing these people and their stories to life, I mean, I really could feel the despair, the exhaustion. These frontline workers, the EMTs, you know, the funeral home directors, the doctors, it was just horrific. I mean, it felt like wartime. It is, you know, it is a war. I can only imagine the PTSD that so many of them are feeling, will continue to feel. How do you think somebody can even begin to heal from those wounds?
I mean, I guess I'm lucky enough not to know, but my guess would be that one way to heal, I hope, for all of us is to acknowledge the experiences, right? To not be tempted to look away from the hardest parts of what people have suffered, but to pay attention to it. And I hope like that's one thing that I can do as a journalist is say to somebody, you know, what you went through, what you're going through, what happened, it matters. And I think maybe if I can help other people understand what it's like, it might matter to them too. I mean, I think like it's, you know, it sometimes is empowering for people to know that like that the hard things that they're going through, the trauma that they're dealing with, it's not happening in a vacuum or in the shadows. Like it's part of an experience that other people are going through, and it might even like illuminate somebody else's experience or the way that they think about what they're going through that's hard. I think that's, you know, and that honestly for me was part of like the you know, what part of made me look forward to every next conversation I was having with people in the book, because it's such a remarkable thing. You know, what I ask of people as a journalist is a huge amount of trust. I mean, because I'm never, as a journalist, I can never pay anybody that I write about. That would mess up the, you know, the ethics of my journalism. I would suddenly be collaborating with them instead of reporting honestly about them and their lives. I can't even let people see the things that I'm going to write about them until it's published, because if I did that, it would be empowering them to be the editors of their own stories, and none of us most fair editors of our own stories, right? So it's so what I'm saying to people is basically all I can promise them is that I'm going to try to do justice to what you went through by being here for long enough, by listening for long enough, and by doing everything I can to get it right, and to make other people understand what happened here. And maybe if I can make other people understand what happened here in some small way, it's going to make them think differently about the way they walk through the world, or what they're going to do the next time they walk into a store and the store clerk says, I'm sorry, like I feel a little nervous, could you please put on a mask, or whatever it is. You know, it's so I guess I always try to remember in my work that like the true act of courage is always on the side of the people that I write about. For me, I finish having these conversations and the story ends. Like I go on to the next person that I'm talking to, or the next thing that I'm writing about. For these people, and this goes back to like how we heal from trauma, it doesn't end. There are no clean endings. Like the story runs, the book is published, and they're still dealing with, Francine is still there in that house where now it's not 3 generations, it's 2, and she's thinking about her mom all the time in that room. So I think part of what I try to do is remember that, you know, like my work is honoring that, and also when I'm writing and when I'm figuring out how to tell these stories, allowing myself to feel some of that weight that like not that I owe it to people to write about their lives in a certain way, but I owe it to them to try to get it right and to try to be fair and honest and empathetic whenever possible.
Yeah, that's perfect. To try and get it right is a huge goal. You gave voice to both sides of the coin by interviewing tenants who were evicted and the landlords who did the evicting, people who could no longer put food on the table, and the grocers who, did their best to extend credit, but still had to pay their bills. Mask mandate supporters and, an anti-masker. With the landlords and the grocers, you gave me, again, someone else's experience, because it's very easy to be like, just let them stay. But you spoke to these landlords who are like, this is my living. You really, you did such a great job of showing me both sides. And then you had, I don't know if I don't remember if you spoke to more than one anti-masker, but you told their story as well. Was it hard for you to put their perspective in there?
Not to put it in there, because it's part of all of our story, right? Like whether we like it or not, and also I think sometimes like a big part of what reading can do, and what I hope I can do as a journalist, is to widen people's perspectives. So like, for instance, with it, I think it's very easy to quickly empathize, I hope, with a tenant who is being evicted in the middle of the pandemic. And also like the simple story sort of demonizes the landlord as like a heartless villain who's kicking people out on the street. But
Yeah,
of course,
probably has loads of money and doesn't really, yeah.
Exactly. But as with most things, the truth is much more nuanced and complicated. And especially now, a lot of these landlords, a huge percentage of landlords in the country are like mom and pop landlords who own a few properties and are trying to survive off of that income and don't have much of a safety net themselves. So then when you flip it and you think about, okay, so this is a small landlord in Florida who just is like eking by and has 6 low-income little properties and now isn't getting paid on 4 of them and is watching her own life sort of go up in smoke, it becomes a little bit more complicated to think about what the problems are and what the solutions are. So, and I think the other thing is, certainly like with people who refuse to wear masks or like aggressively were agitating on anti-mask movements, like those perspectives are not my own. I think that's clear in the book and in the stories. But at the same time, they are part of what made this pandemic what it was for all of us. So trying to find some way to illuminate like why people think that way, how they think that way, it's important. Because it's unfortunately like looking away from those perspectives is not working. It's too big of a chorus of voices right now. So
Right.
I think it was important to try to include some of that too.
So that brings me beautifully to my next question. So your last book, Rising Out of Hatred, which I tell people frequently, every person in this country should read. It deals with the white nationalist movement and the spreading of white supremacy all the way up to the White House. Do you see a correlation between that movement and the polarization during COVID?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think like, they share a lot of like disinformation at the center, sort of this borrowed nostalgia for some problematic American ideals, right? So like for white nationalists, it's thinking back to this really problematic idea, but unfortunately a historical idea of America as a country that was built for white people and built to empower white people. And tragically, that's the truth. And that's the work that all of us need to do to dismantle. But for white nationalists, they take that and they say, this is our country. It's this really awful idea of white ownership. And similarly, I think people who are anti-vax who are spreading a lot of disinformation about COVID do it under the idea of like American liberty. Like nobody can tell me what to do. This is like coming for my freedoms. You're taking something that's mine. You're taking away something that is my own personal liberty, and that's part of what makes America what it's been. So this sort of like very like twisted historical idea of sort of Americanism, I guess, I think is a part of both of them. And also I think like the online spread of disinformation is what's grown both of these worlds. White nationalism has tragically like had a historic moment, in part because so many people are online. That's how they're consuming their information, and white nationalists have taken advantage of that, and so have conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxers and people who believe that the government is run by a deep state and all of these other things that are the framework is not totally dissimilar. And I also think in the Venn diagram of white nationalists, like anti-government conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxers, like there's a lot of shared space there. So and I guess the other thing that I would say is that people are susceptible to come into both of those ideas, both of those awful ideas, through their own places of disenfranchisement and pain sometimes, right? So it's like people who feel like the country is not seeing them, acknowledging their problems, like it's working against them, are much more likely to go to this dark us versus them conspiratorial thinking, whether that's white nationalism or the government is a deep state and they're trying to put microchips in a vaccine to make sure that they know exactly what we're doing at all times. I mean, I think they both come from that same place of darkness.
Yeah. Well stated. You have a chapter in here about a long hauler, a young Chicago woman. She and her husband both got COVID very early on. After a week or so of feeling really poorly, her husband was on the mend and kept getting better, and she did not. She was a former soccer player, a career woman, and now she's on long-term disability with this variety of bizarre symptoms and needs almost full-time care. And so I have read that some long haulers found some relief after taking the vaccine. Do you know if Caitlin has gotten any better, or?
She's doing a little bit better. She still can't work. She got vaccinated. I think she's not sure if that helped some symptoms or if like all of the therapy she's been doing has helped some symptoms, but she's still on disability. She can't work. Her life has been, at least for the moment, like profoundly upended. And I think one of the things that's scary about this pandemic and this virus is that we don't know, right? Like we have no idea. It's too early to know. 5 years from now, is Caitlin going to be better? Is she going to be worse? Like she doesn't know, and that's that's terrifying. Like and I think also some of the frustrations for Caitlin and also for a lot of people in the early days is that doctors didn't know either, and to a certain degree still don't know, right? So like early on in the pandemic, doctors didn't really know how to treat this. It was new to them too. They didn't know what they were seeing, and if you look at even like rates of how many people were surviving on ventilators early on in the pandemic, 80% of people who went on vents in New York wouldn't make it, and that's improved to more than half, and so we've gotten better at treating some aspects. I think Caitlin's hope, and mine too, is that the long haul COVID, which certainly in the early days of the pandemic was sort of only whispered about and some people didn't believe in, now at least there's like scientific consensus that this is a big thing. It's happening to a lot of people, and especially with like a country where such a massive percentage have been infected and will be infected. These ongoing problems are going to be not only like have massive personal repercussions, but also will have huge repercussions for our healthcare systems. Like, so it's something that I hope like a lot of resources will go to paying attention to.
I could not agree more. And so many people have played armchair quarterback with government responses. whether it's, the masks or closing businesses or the vaccine rollout, election safety. And, there are people in my circles who will openly wonder why everything feels so haphazard and half-assed. And, and then I read your chapter on the election official and what he did. He was trying, here he is, he's an election official, right? Another just local guy doing just a, behind the scenes job, not going to get any national fanfare. And now he's got to try, we've got this election and he's got to try and make it safe for people. And so he had this whole team coming up with a way to make voting safe, but stay under budget, because you're just some local official. You don't have a whole lot of money. And someone comes up with breaking a Q-tip in half and then wrapping foil around the stem, dipping it in water, and using that as a disposable stylus. I could almost feel like the aha moment. Again, your writing just brings the reader in to, I'm watching this Q-tip and I'm in his mind going, oh my God, this will work. And yet every victory comes with like 2 additional challenges then. Sure. Then he's got to figure out these next steps. But that's where I was just awed by men like that, who they just kept chipping away and chipping away at these problems.
I think that's like resilience in general, which it certainly is thematic in this book. It is,
yes,
it's so remarkable. Yeah, he was, the styluses stick with me. The fact he was trying to figure out like how to disinfect pens, and so he liked to eat pho for lunch sometime. He was like, oh, these
the takeout containers.
So he would go to like all the different pho restaurants in Florida and stomp on these containers in the parking lot to see which ones were the strongest. And she's like,
yes,
this is what the presidential election is now coming down to in this key part of Florida. This guy trying to figure out which pho containers might, people tried so hard. And that goes for like an election official. It goes for the woman Tuesday Barr, who is being evicted and just trying to figure out like, how do I find a place for my grandkid, and what do I do? And it goes for somebody like the family of a woman in the book, Darlene, in upstate New York, who, as I talked to her, thinking I thought I was going to be writing a piece about a long hauler, but in fact it turned out like she was getting worse and she was dying. And then instead of talking to her as she deteriorated, I was talking to her son, and just watching a family also trying to figure out how do you keep putting one foot in front of the other in the middle of this thing. I think I took a lot of like heart and inspiration sometimes from how people were able to just figure it out and keep going, even against like remarkable amounts of trauma.
Yeah. Mary Jo Copeland's chapter is titled "On Choosing Decency Over Anxiety and Fear." And her story reminded me of the Mr. Rogers, the often quoted Mr. Rogers, look for the helpers. Right. And so Mary Jo volunteers at Catholic Charities. And when someone's despairing, that all the news is bad, the world's falling apart, Mary Jo said, okay, then stop watching. What's something you can do? And she talked about the thousands of people lining up for help. And the quote, these people fall through the cracks and the cracks become canyons. And sometimes all she can do is listen to them saying, you wouldn't believe the power that a little kindness can have on people. It restores our humanity. I guess my question's obvious. What kind of effect did talking to the Mary Jo's have on you as you worked on this book?
Yeah, profound, I would say. In part because, for Mary Jo, like she would just say like on repeat, kindness and grace, which is a really profound idea and such a hard thing to model, especially at a time when, all of us had, I think, a lot of like righteous reasons to be angry and frustrated, whether that was like with how the pandemic was handled, with how our fellow, citizens in our communities were acting, just all of the, all of the space that grew between us during this. And this kind of goes to, I see there's a question in the chat from Jo, and anybody else feel free to put questions in there too. But Jo asks, like, how did talking to, all of these people who didn't believe in masking or vaccines or COVID, like when they see these things manifest in the world and it still doesn't impact their thinking, like how does that happen? How do they still not change their minds? And what were their stories and experiences? And I think one thing that I've thought about a lot, and this goes back to the last book too, with Rising Out of Hatred, is how you change people's minds, right? And the truth is, I think like data and facts, this is depressing to say it, but data and facts don't often change people's minds, especially now at this moment in the country. Like I was just, this week I've been at a hospital in rural Washington where there's a vaccine mandate at this hospital. So as there is statewide in Washington, it just took effect. So it's either get the vaccine or you lose your job. And this hospital initially had 40% uptake of the vaccine. And these are nurses who've been treating, they've spent the last year seeing the virus. They don't, it's not that they don't believe in COVID. It's not that they don't know how bad it can be. What's holding them in place is their relationships, right? Like their spouses don't think that the vaccines are good. Everybody on their Facebook pages doesn't think the vaccines are good. Everybody in their community is saying, you don't really need to wear a mask at the grocery store. And suddenly you have all of these like confirmational ideas, and going against them is a huge risk, right? It's like part of like some of the people at this hospital who did in the end decide to get vaccinated did it without telling their spouses because they thought it might end my marriage. If my husband knows that I got vaccinated, that's going to be such like so out of step politically and in every other way with the community that I live in, that it might cost me the central relationship in my life. So instead, I'm going to get vaccinated to keep my job, and I'm going to lie to my spouse about it. So, I think what has a potential chance sometimes to impact people, especially the people we care about, is listening and is kindness and grace and is trying to give people, trying to not say like, if you don't believe in the vaccines, if you don't believe in this, if you don't think this way, you're just stupid. Like you don't like you're dead wrong. You're an idiot. Instead, trying to say, why? Like, how come you think that way? Like, and then maybe building a relationship that opens into a conversation where they might trust you enough to listen to some of your ideas and to hear what you think. I think, it's often like the relationship building where we can make a difference with people. And that also means that, those of us in our families who have people around us who like us and who care about us, who might distrust the vaccine or who might be spreading disinformation online, if it's somebody who cares about you and who you care about, maybe you're the person who can get through to them in some small way. Those conversations are hard and they're difficult, but if we don't have them with the people that we love and care about, nobody else is going to change their minds. So I think some of it is like taking that work on ourselves when we can do it. That's
really beautifully said. I have one more of a thought than than a question. In your introduction, you write, I worried when I first began this project that a year or so of so many intense conversations could become depressing or even numbing, but in fact, it was the opposite. The people in this book inspired me with their ability to trust, their empathy, their insight, their candor, their emotional courage. I wasn't sure that I would be able to feel the same way when I was reading your introduction. I thought, I just don't know. But then I read stories like Tuesday Bar, where she finds hope even as she's being evicted from her home. These little moments where she's able to get a truck and somebody to help her move something. She found hope. And then, a new definition for faith in the Graveson family story with their 15 and 16-year-old sons, who both contracted COVID and were hospitalized in dire condition. They said, I understand a lot more now about what faith is really about, which comes when you have nothing else left. And after reading each chapter and feeling every emotion possible, I too was left just feeling inspired. And I hope that each person who sees this interview will be inspired to buy a copy of this book or 2 copies. You know, I say about this book, and I mean it 100%. This is the book I'm going to give to my grandchildren one day. I'm going to give it to them, you know, these little grandchildren who I hope will have no memory of what COVID was like, you know, masks and all these things. But one day they'll need to understand what living in this time was like. And your book is the one that I will give to them so that they can understand that. I love it.
Thank you. That means a lot to me, and it makes me even more excited that now you'll have 3 grandchildren very soon.
I will any time now. I've appreciated talking to you so much. You have a beautiful gift for making me react a little less and think a little more. And I think in today's world, that is something we all need a little bit more of. So I appreciate it so much. I don't know if there are any other questions there. I'm sure Alex is standing by to come on in. And I know, Eli, you're getting ready. You're heading out soon too. You're headed off somewhere else tonight.
Some more reporting. But yeah, thank you so much, Mary. I mean, I really, I appreciate that. And I appreciate, you know, not only how closely you read and think about this stuff, but also how you do it with heart. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you both for a riveting discussion. I've taken so much away from this. And you know, you said earlier, no clean endings. And unfortunately, I think that's probably true. And the messiness of it all is going to be something that we're going to be dealing with for a long time. But also just what you said about building relationships, Eli, and building trust with those who perhaps the easier impulse is just to yell at them. And thank you for that. I think that's the lesson that we can all learn from. Certainly, I know I can. So thank you both for an astonishing, riveting discussion. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. We love to do these online events, but in order to continue putting them on, we really do need your support. So please do consider purchasing a copy of Eli's book from us. Again, it's on the website. You can give us a call or shoot us an email. Thank you both. Safe travels to you, Eli, and your reporting. Mary, fingers crossed for you. And thank you all for watching, and hopefully we'll see you sometime with the events that we have going on next week.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thanks again.